The squeal of baggage carousel 3 was the loneliest sound in the world. At 3 in the morning, Northwood Regional Airport wasn't just quiet, it was a mausoleum with fluorescent lighting. The last flight had deplaned hours ago, leaving me, the new guy on the overnight maintenance crew, to witness the terminal's private nightly rituals. This was one of them. The carousel groaned to life, its rubber flaps slapping a tired rhythm against the stainless steel siding. Only one item rode its slow, looping journey: a black leather doctor's bag. It looked ancient, the kind of thing you'd see in a dusty photograph from a century ago, its surface scuffed and cracked like dry skin. My job was simple: retrieve it, take it to the interfaith chapel on the mezzanine, and leave it. I stepped forward as it passed, my hand hesitating for a moment before I grasped the handle. The cold was immediate and shocking, seeping through my work glove. It wasn't the sterile cold of metal. It felt unnervingly like cold human skin. I hoisted it off the belt, and my arm buckled under the weight. It was unnaturally heavy, a dense, sloshing weight, as if it were filled not with medical instruments, but with something dense and wet. The thought made my stomach clench. That bag is for the doctor who still makes house calls. The voice was a low gravel, startling me in the immense quiet. I turned to see a man leaning against a pillar, his maintenance uniform as worn as the terminal around us. He was older, with a face carved from granite and patience. "You pray you're never on his patient list," he added, his eyes fixed on the bag in my hand. This was Silas Croft, my new supervisor. He hadn't said much during my 5-minute interview, and he seemed even less inclined to talk now. A normal person, a person with options, would have set the bag down, walked out of those automatic doors, and never looked back. But I wasn't a normal person anymore, not since the pink slip had landed on my desk back in Minneapolis. My career in logistics had evaporated overnight, leaving me with dwindling savings and the gnawing acid of panic. This job, this strange, nocturnal post in a forgotten airport, wasn't a career move. It was a life raft, and I was clinging to it with everything I had. So I ignored the red flags. I had to. "Right," I managed, my voice sounding thin. "To the chapel, you said?" Silas just nodded, his gaze sweeping over the empty terminal. That's when I started to notice it too. The airport wasn't just old, it felt sickly. The faint, persistent smell of ozone from the flickering lights mingled with a deeper, mustier scent of decay, like damp earth and spoiled meat. Water stains bloomed on the ceiling tiles like old bruises, and the air itself felt heavy, charged with a static that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. This place didn't just need maintenance, it needed a priest. Silas pushed himself off the pillar and started walking, and I saw the pronounced limp in his right leg, a stiff, dragging motion that seemed to cause him quiet pain with every step. I fell in beside him, my arms straining against the bag's bizarre weight. As he gestured for me to follow him toward the employee break room, I caught a glimpse of his left hand. The tip of his index finger was gone, sheared off in a clean, white scar. Every part of him seemed to be a testament to the job's hazards, silent warnings etched into his very body. He was a man physically marked by his workplace, and the realization sent a fresh wave of unease through me. "Leo Vance, was it?" he asked, not looking at me. "Yeah, Leo." "You'll learn the routines," he said, the words carrying no comfort. "There are protocols for everything." I glanced from his scarred hand to his limping gait, then back to the grotesque bag I was carrying. My desperation had made me deaf to my own instincts, but now they were screaming. The strange weight, the smell of the air, the man walking beside me who looked like a survivor of some unspoken war, it all coalesced into a single, terrifying thought. I had made a terrible mistake. But the rent was due, and Minneapolis was 1,000 miles and a lifetime away. I tightened my grip on the cold leather handle, the bag's contents shifting with a soft, wet thud. Silas didn't seem to be welcoming me to a job. He was delivering a grim prognosis. And I was already his patient. The real orientation, I suspected, was about to begin. The employee break room was just as weary as the rest of the terminal. The light from a single fluorescent tube flickered erratically, casting the small, windowless space in a jaundiced glow. It smelled of stale coffee and something else, something metallic and faintly acrid, like old blood. Silas limped over to a dented metal locker and pulled out a thin, manila folder, its edges soft and frayed from use. He tossed it onto the grimy formica table between us. It landed with a flat, final sound. "Here," he said, his voice low. He sat down heavily, the chair groaning in protest. "Read it. Memorize it. The official story is that these are just operational procedures, quirks of an old building." He leaned forward, his eyes catching the flickering light, and the granite in his face seemed to crumble into something more like exhaustion. "They aren't. These aren't suggestions, Leo. They're tourniquets. They stop the bleeding, but they don't fix the wound." The metaphor hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I opened the folder. Inside were about a dozen typed pages, stained and dog-eared. The title was simple: Overnight Terminal Protocols. I started reading. Most were mundane. Check the circuit breakers in the East Concourse. Log any PA system malfunctions. Ensure all service doors are locked. But then I got to rule number 3. Protocol number 3, the doctor's bag, to be collected from Carousel 3 at 0300 nightly and delivered to the mezzanine chapel. Do not open the bag. Do not delay delivery. A cold sweat pricked my neck. I thought of the shocking skin-like cold that had seeped through my glove. I had been one careless movement away from breaking a rule I hadn't even known existed. What would have happened? Frostbite? A chemical burn? Silas's expression suggested it was something far worse. I swallowed hard and read on. Protocol number 5, the North Wing restroom. Between 0330 and 0430, you may hear knocking from inside the handicapped stall. Do not investigate. Do not answer. Under no circumstances are you to open the door, even if you hear someone asking for help. Asking for help? I looked up at Silas. He just stared at me. "It's not just knocking," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Sometimes there's a voice. A distorted, wet whispering. It knows things. It might sound like a child or a woman crying. It mimics. It knows how to sound like it needs you." My blood ran cold. I forced my eyes back to the page. Protocol number 7, Gate 23. The security camera feed for this gate is prone to anomalies. Do not stare at the monitor for more than a few seconds at a time. Report any sustained static to the shift log. Silas gestured with his chin toward a bank of grainy black and white monitors in the corner. "Watch!" He pointed to the screen labeled Gate 23. It showed an empty waiting area, the rows of seats like silent parishioners in a dark church. It looked completely normal. I watched, my breath held, for what felt like an eternity. Nothing. I don't see anything. It was there and then gone in less than a heartbeat. For a single, impossible frame, a silhouette stood by the jet bridge door. It was impossibly tall and thin, its limbs stretched to inhuman proportions, its head nearly touching the ceiling. Then the screen dissolved into a furious blizzard of static, an angry hiss crackling from the monitor's speaker. A moment later, the image returned. The gate was empty. Normal. I recoiled from the screen, my heart hammering against my ribs. What the hell was that? "We don't know," Silas said, his gaze fixed on the now empty gate on the screen. He looked profoundly tired. "That's what this job is. This place, it's a filter. It catches things that are trying to cross over, things that get stuck between where they were and where they're going. We're not janitors, Leo. We're keepers. We're not maintaining a balance. We're just trying to keep the filter from breaking." The sheer, insane gravity of what he was saying crashed down on me. This wasn't a job. It was a sentence. I thought of the man I was replacing, the name they'd mentioned in my brief HR onboarding. "What happened to the last guy?" I asked, my voice shaky. "Cole Johansson. They said he had a heart attack." Silas was silent for a long moment, studying my face, probably gauging if I was going to run screaming for the exit. He must have seen the trapped desperation there, the same thing that kept him limping through these halls every night. "A heart attack is what the paperwork says," he said finally. "They found him in the employee parking garage at sunrise." He'd smashed every mirror in his car from the inside. The windshield, the rear view, the side mirrors, all shattered. The coroner said he died of fright, but the first responders, they said his face was frozen in a scream. He paused, letting the final terrible detail land. And he was looking at his own reflection in the one piece of the rearview mirror that was still hanging from the windshield. He let me absorb that. He let the image burn itself behind my eyes, a man so terrified of his own face that he died from it. The folder on the table no longer looked like a set of rules. It looked like a survival guide for a war, one hadn't known I was fighting. And as I stared at my own faint, distorted reflection in the dark screen of the monitor for Gate 23, I felt the first, true tendrils of the same fear that must have broken Cole Johansson. The bleeding had already started. Now, I just had to learn how to use the tourniquets. My first official task was also the one I dreaded most. With the list of protocols burning a hole in my pocket, I picked up the doctor's bag again. The walk to the mezzanine felt like a mile. Every flicker of an overhead light, every distant hum from a vending machine, seemed to magnify in the oppressive silence. My own footsteps echoed back at me, too loud, announcing my presence to whatever lurked in the shadows of the empty concourse. The bag, clutched tight in my gloved hand, felt like a dead thing I was escorting to its grave. Or worse, to its operating table. The Interfaith Chapel wasn't much of a chapel at all. It was little more than a closet tucked away behind a row of disconnected payphones, marked by a small, generic symbol of a person kneeling. The air inside was colder than the rest of the terminal, a dead, still cold that didn't just chill the skin but seemed to sink right into your bones. There was no stained glass, no pews, just a few chairs, a bare lectern, and a simple wooden table that served as an altar. My instructions were to place the bag on that table. I did, my arms screaming with relief as I let go of the unnatural weight. The silence that followed was absolute. For a moment, I felt a ridiculous urge to say something, like "special delivery" or "here you go," just to break the suffocating tension. Instead, I backed away slowly, my eyes locked on the bag as if it might spring open. I pulled the door shut, the latch clicking into place with a sound that felt deafeningly final. I stood there for a second, my heart pounding in my ears. I'd followed the rules. I'd survived. Then I heard it. Through the solid wood of the door, a sound unlike any I had ever heard before. It was a sharp, distinct crack, like a thick branch snapping underfoot, or a large bone being forcibly set. It was immediately followed by a low, pained groan. It wasn't entirely human. It was too deep, too guttural, a sound of profound agony that vibrated through the floor and up my legs. It was the sound of a procedure being performed on something that was very, very unwilling. My training, the memory of Cole Johansson, screamed at me not to investigate, not to linger. I turned and walked away, my pace quickening with every step, the sound of that terrible groan chasing me down the hall. The wet, sloshing weight of the bag finally made a horrifying kind of sense. It wasn't just filled with tools, it was filled with supplies. I was leaning against a pillar, trying to get my breathing under control, when Silas found me. He didn't say anything, just stood nearby, his limp more pronounced under the buzzing fluorescent lights. He knew. Of course, he knew what I'd heard. My eyes scanned the area wildly, looking for anything normal, anything that made sense. They landed on a small, tarnished brass plaque mounted on the wall next to the chapel door. I hadn't noticed it before. I pushed myself off the pillar and stepped closer to read the engraved words. In memory of Dr. Alistair Finch, terminal physician, 1968 to 1985. He answered every call. "A doctor," I said, a wave of relief washing over me. It was misplaced, I knew, but I grabbed onto it anyway. So there was a doctor here. This is all in his memory then? A tradition? Silas emitted a dry, mirthless chuckle. Oh, he's more than a memory, Leo. That's him in there. That's his chapel. And his bag. I stared at him, my temporary relief evaporating into pure dread. What are you talking about? It says he died in 85. He did, Silas confirmed, his gaze distant. Right here, in this terminal. He was performing what the board of directors later called a radical, unsanctioned medical procedure on a passenger, trying to fix something that wasn't broken in a way medicine could understand. He looked from the plaque back to me, his eyes dark with a weary certainty. Alistair Finch believed that some travelers arrived here carrying more than just luggage. He thought some ailments weren't of the body, but were attachments, things that clung to people on their journeys. He let that sink in, the sounds from the chapel, the grotesque weight of the bag. Dr. Alistair Finch. He thought he could cut them away, Silas continued, his voice dropping lower. He never stopped working, not even when his own heart gave out on him. That plaque says he answered every call. He pointed his scarred finger at the chapel door. He still does, especially the ones that come from places we can't see. The noble inscription on the plaque suddenly twisted in my mind, the words warping from dedication into a sinister, obsessive epitaph. He answered every call. The bag, the groans, the wet, dense weight. Dr. Finch wasn't a ghost haunting this place. He was still the terminal physician, and his work, it seemed, was never, ever done. For 2 weeks I lived by the protocols. I became a creature of ritual and fear, my movements dictated by the stained pages in Silas's folder. I learned the precise moment to turn my gaze from the monitor for gate 23. I learned to ignore the wet, pleading whispers from the north wing restroom. I delivered the doctor's bag with the grim efficiency of an undertaker. I was surviving. And then Rick Nowak arrived. He was a temp hired to cover a few weeks while another maintenance guy was on long-term medical leave. Rick swaggered into the break room with the kind of loud, misplaced confidence that instantly set my teeth on edge. He was younger than me, with a gym-built physique and a smirk that suggested he'd already figured out the world and found it lacking. He saw the quiet, grim way Silas and I went about our work and mistook it for weakness. "Lighten up, you two," he'd said on his first night, clapping me on the back hard enough to make me stumble. "It's a quiet airport, not a tomb. You act like you're defusing a bomb." Silas just gave him a long, flat look. "In a way," he'd mumbled, "we are." Rick's arrogance, I soon learned, was his greatest liability. On his third night, the baggage carousel groaned to life at 0300, and Rick practically jogged to meet it. "I got it, Pops," he called over to Silas, waving him off. "The gloves, Rick," I warned, my voice tight. He scoffed, grabbing the doctor's bag with his bare hands. "It's a handle, not a hot plate." He lifted it, his smirk faltering for a split second as the unnatural weight settled in. But the real change was immediate. I saw him flinch, his knuckles turning white. "Damn, that's cold," he hissed, quickly shifting his grip. By the time he'd carried it to the chapel and back, his bravado was gone, replaced by a sullen anger. He kept flexing his fingers, rubbing his hands together. An hour later, under the break room's flickering light, I saw it. Thin black lines were spiderwebbing across the back of his hands, branching out from his knuckles like frost creeping across a window pane. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, staring at his own skin with a mix of fury and fear. "You should see a doctor," Silas said, his voice devoid of any sympathy. Rick did. The medics who came couldn't explain it. They called it a severe frostbite reaction, but the temperature in the terminal was a stable 68 degrees. His skin, they said, looked like it had been flash frozen, the cells dead and dying. They wrapped his hands in thick gauze and told him to stay home, but Rick, stubborn and furious, showed up for his shift the next night, determined to prove he wasn't spooked. His arrogance had curdled into a dangerous defiance. That was the night he decided to confront the restroom. The knocking from the handicapped stall started right on schedule, a soft, rhythmic thump, thump, thump. "That's it," Rick seethed, his bandaged hands clenched into fists. "I'm sick of this haunted house crap." "Rick, no," I said, stepping in his way. "Rule number 5. You just leave it alone." "It's probably a busted pipe, Vance. Get out of my way." He shoved past me. He didn't just open the door. In an act of supreme hubris, he grabbed a rubber doorstop and wedged it underneath, propping the stall door wide open. "There," he announced to the empty restroom. "Happy now? No more knocking." The knocking stopped. The whispering I'd grown accustomed to hearing, the pleas for help, the faint, wet sobs, also stopped. An immense, profound silence poured out of that open stall, a silence that felt heavier and more threatening than any sound. The air grew cold, and the smell of ozone and decay intensified tenfold. Rick laughed, a short, nervous bark. "See? Nothing." But something had changed. The pressure in the terminal felt different. The shadows seemed darker, hungrier. The entity was no longer contained. We didn't see Rick for the next hour. When his scheduled check-in passed, Silas and I went looking. We found him cowering in the food court, huddled under a table, his back pressed against a pillar. His bandaged hands were pressed to his mouth, and his eyes were wide with a terror so absolute it had paralyzed him. He was rocking back and forth, whispering the same phrase over and over again, his voice a choked, ragged whimper. The man with the too-wide smile. The man with the too-wide smile. "Rick!" Silas knelt beside him, trying to get his attention. "Rick, what did you see?" Rick's eyes finally focused, not on us, but on a spot over Silas's shoulder. His face, already pale, turned the color of ash. "He's wearing the janitor's face," he whispered. "He's wearing the janitor's face now." I looked behind us. There was no one there. Just the empty, gleaming floors of the terminal. Later, when the paramedics were wheeling a catatonic Rick away on a stretcher, Silas found a neatly folded maintenance uniform stuffed into the trash can inside the North Wing restroom. It was identical to the one I was wearing. Rick Nowak wasn't fired. He didn't quit. He was taken to a long-term care facility, completely and utterly broken. As I watched the ambulance's flashing lights disappear into the pre-dawn gloom, I finally understood. The rules weren't just protecting us. We were the last line of defense. We were the locks on the cage. And Rick had just handed one of the inmates the key. Rick Nowak's departure left a void in the terminal, a chilling silence where his loud confidence used to be. The incident with the restroom had changed things. The whispers were gone, but the feeling of being watched was now constant, a heavy pressure at the back of my neck. The entity Rick had let out was now part of the terminal's ambient dread, a free-roaming malignancy. It was a failure, and I felt the weight of it every time I walked past that wing. About a week later, Silas cornered me in the break room. He didn't look angry or disappointed. He just looked older, the lines around his eyes etched deeper. He was holding another folder, this one a stark, clinical white, a stark contrast to the grimy manila one I had come to know. "You've been here a month now," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You didn't run, you didn't break." He slid the white folder across the table. It was heavier than the first one. "You've survived the orientation. Now the real work begins." I stared at the folder, a knot of ice forming in my stomach. Level 2? "Some things in this place are predictable," Silas explained, ignoring my question. "The bag, the gate, the old restroom ghost. They're loops. Annoying, dangerous, but loops all the same. Level 2 isn't about loops. It's about active containment." I opened the folder. The protocols inside were printed on crisp, clean paper. There were fewer rules, but they were more specific, more bizarre. My eyes immediately found the next two on the list. Protocol number 9, the central terminal elevator. Do not use this elevator for any reason. If you are required to access the upper floors, use the service stairs in the west concourse. If the elevator doors open on their own to reveal floor 3, do not approach. Avert your eyes and vacate the area immediately. Protocol number 10, the payphone bank. One payphone in the bank near the chapel is still active. It will ring once per night. You are required to answer it. Identify yourself as the custodian. Listen to the message. Do not speak other than to identify yourself. The message is not for you. Why? What's on floor 3? I asked, looking up at Silas. The third floor was officially listed as, quote, decommissioned storage on all the terminal maps. That's the long-term storage, he said, his voice grim, for the ones that are too angry to move on and too hungry to be let loose. The ones Dr. Finch couldn't treat, Finch put them there. We just make sure they stay there. That night, my new duties began. As I did my rounds, a soft ding echoed through the central atrium. I froze. The old elevator I always passed, the one whose call button I had assumed was dead, had lit up. The brass doors slid open with a smooth, silent hiss, revealing not a car, but an empty, dark shaft. The number 3 was illuminated above the door in a sickly red light. I remembered the rule. Avert your eyes. But I couldn't. From the blackness of the empty shaft, a sound began to emanate. It wasn't loud, but it pierced through my skull, a high-frequency whine that felt like a needle being pushed directly into my brain. My vision swam. A splitting headache exploded behind my eyes, and a warm trickle of blood ran from my nose, dripping onto the polished floor. I stumbled back, clamping my hands over my ears, but the sound wasn't in the air. It was inside my head. I forced myself to turn and flee, the sound receding as I put distance between myself and the open elevator. Shaken, I continued my rounds, my head still throbbing. Then, exactly as the protocol predicted, one of the old payphones began to ring, a shrill, piercing sound that was utterly alien in the dead quiet. My heart hammered against my ribs. You are required to answer it. My hand trembled as I lifted the heavy plastic receiver. It was cold and greasy. The custodian, I said, my voice barely a croak. For a moment there was only static. Then a voice came through the line, a dry, rasping whisper that sounded like dead leaves skittering across pavement. It wasn't a grieving relative or a lost message. It was a personal threat, delivered with a chilling intimacy. We saw you in Minneapolis, Leo Vance. My blood turned to ice. It couldn't be. We saw you lose your job. We saw you packing your car. We were so hungry then, watching you from across the street. So desperate. The voice was filled with a dry, ancient amusement. We're hungrier now. The line went dead. I slammed the phone back into its cradle, my entire body shaking. This wasn't a message for someone else. This wasn't a random echo from the past. This was for me. It had followed me. Or worse, it had been waiting for me. I looked wildly around the empty terminal, at the deep shadows pooling in every corner. My desperation hadn't just led me to this place. It had been a beacon. I wasn't a random hire. I was a chosen one. And whatever had chosen me was just getting started. The first snow came in early November, not as a gentle dusting, but as a sudden, violent squall that threw a curtain of white across the airfield. The wind howled around the corners of the terminal, a mournful, hungry sound that seemed to seep through the glass. The change in the airport's atmosphere was immediate and palpable. The familiar, lingering dread I had grown accustomed to was now sharpened, honed to a razor's edge by the biting cold. I found Silas staring out one of the massive plate glass windows at the swirling snow, his reflection a ghostly twin superimposed over the storm. He didn't turn when I approached. Winter's different, he said, his voice a low murmur against the sound of the wind. The cold makes the veil thinner, and it brings visitors. He finally looked at me, his eyes holding a new kind of warning. Winter doesn't just attract the lost, Leo. It attracts the hungry. Things that look for warmth and find it inside the living. His words were still echoing in my mind when I went on my first patrol of the exterior walkways. The snow was already ankle-deep, and my boots made the only sound, a lonely crunching in the swirling silence. Protocol for winter storms was simple. Check the de-icing equipment sheds at the end of the service tarmac. It was a miserable, freezing walk, but it was routine. As I made my way back toward the terminal, a flicker of movement under a security light caught my eye. I stopped, peering through the driving snow. There, pressed into the fresh powder, was a single set of tracks. They were barefoot. The prints were long and narrow, the toes splayed unnaturally wide. They led from the dark perimeter fence, stopped in the middle of the tarmac, and then just ended. There were no tracks leading away. Whatever had made them had either vanished into thin air or gone straight up. A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold traced its way down my spine. I took a hesitant step back, my eyes darting into the darkness beyond the lights. I turned, intending to get back inside as fast as I could. That's when I saw them. A fresh set of tracks had appeared in the snow directly behind me. They were just a few feet away, perfectly formed in the untouched powder where I had just been standing. They hadn't been there a second ago. I hadn't heard a thing over the wind. Something had been silently stalking me, matching my pace, so close I should have felt its breath on my neck. I didn't wait to see if it was still there. I ran, my lungs burning with frigid air, not daring to look back until the heavy steel door of the terminal slammed shut behind me. Later that night, the next rule came into play. I was in the security office, the monitors showing nothing but the ghostly dance of snow. Then a new sound drifted down the empty concourse, faint at first, then growing clearer. It was the sound of children's laughter. It wasn't joyful. It was sharp and mocking, a high-pitched, cruel sound that scraped at my nerves. It echoed from the vaulted ceilings, making it impossible to pinpoint the source. It sounded like it was coming from everywhere at once. Leo. My name, drawn out in a sing-song whisper, slithered through the laughter. It sounded like a little girl's voice, but it was threaded with an ancient malice. Come and play, Leo, we're so cold. The Level 2 folder had a protocol for this too. Rule number 11, the winter visitors. You may hear voices or laughter during a snowstorm. Do not leave the main concourse. Do not follow the sounds. They will use your name. They will feign distress. It is a lure. I stayed frozen in the office, my knuckles white on the edge of the desk, listening as the chorus of phantom children called my name, their laughter growing more frantic, more insistent. It was a siren song of the damned, promising a game with rules I couldn't possibly know and a price I couldn't afford to pay. They were outside, somewhere in the storm, or perhaps they were the storm itself. They were cold, and they were looking for warmth. Silas was right. Winter was here, and it had brought its own brand of hunger. The terminal was no longer just a filter. It was a baited trap, and now the things outside knew my name. The storm that had been teasing us for weeks finally descended with the fury of a vengeful god. By midnight, Northwood Regional was buried. The wind screamed like a banshee, plastering snow against the terminal windows in thick, suffocating sheets. All flights had been canceled hours ago, but the airport was far from empty. The blizzard had stirred the hornet's nest. The change was terrifying. The entities I had learned to coexist with, the fleeting silhouette at Gate 23, the faint echoes in the halls, were no longer passive. The terminal's phantom passengers, usually just translucent figures sitting in quiet rows, now seemed more solid, more present. As I walked my patrol route down the main concourse, they turned their heads in perfect silent unison to watch me pass. Their gazes weren't vacant anymore. They were heavy, malevolent, and filled with a cold, patient hunger. The air crackled with a hostile energy, the pressure of 100 pairs of unseen eyes tracking my every move. It was in this charged atmosphere that I saw her, a little girl, no older than 7, standing alone near the snow-blind windows of the West Concourse. She wore a bright pink winter coat, a shocking splash of color in the monochrome gloom. My heart lurched. No passenger could have been left behind, not in a storm this bad. It is a lure, the words from the protocol screamed in my mind. I stopped, keeping my distance, my hand hovering over the radio on my belt. The girl turned, and a small, hopeful smile lit up her face. "Have you seen my mommy?" she asked, her voice clear and sweet, cutting through the howl of the wind. "She said to wait right here." Every instinct I had honed over the past few months went on high alert. I looked down, my eyes catching our reflections in the highly polished floor. My own was normal, a tired, scared man in a maintenance uniform. Hers was not. In the distorted reflection, the girl's innocent smile was stretched impossibly wide, a predatory grin that reached from ear to ear. The sweet child was a mask. This was the trap. This was what the winter visitors did. "She's in the chapel," a woman's voice said from behind me. I spun around. A woman stood there, her back to me, looking toward the girl. She had the weary posture of a worried mother. "I was just praying. Clara, honey, come on. This kind man can walk with us." The name, Clara, sent a jolt through me. It was the same name the childish voices had whispered in the first snow. The mother started walking toward the mezzanine, and the little girl in the pink coat skipped to fall in step beside her. She glanced back at me, her eyes glinting with an intelligence far older than her apparent years. My blood ran cold. The chapel. The place where Dr. Finch performed his procedures. My mind raced, recalling a detail Silas had mentioned in passing when he'd given me the Level 2 folder. "Sometimes," he'd said, "the doctor gets a patient he can't handle alone. When that happens, a second bag appears on the carousel. A backup kit. The real, heavy-duty stuff." On pure, desperate instinct I ran. Not after them, but toward the baggage claim. The carousel was still. I slammed the emergency activation button, and it groaned to life. And there, riding the belt in a solitary loop, was a second doctor's bag. This one was different, made of dark, oiled canvas, not leather, and it felt strangely light. I grabbed it and sprinted toward the mezzanine, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. I reached the chapel door just as the little girl, Clara, was about to close it. I shoved my way inside. The trap sprung. The mother turned around, and I nearly screamed. Her face wasn't a face. It was a smooth, blank canvas of skin with no eyes, no nose. Only a gaping black maw that opened wide and emitted a deafening psychic shriek that felt like it was tearing my thoughts apart. The girl, Clara, threw her head back and laughed, but the sound that came out was not that of a child. It was a deep, ancient, guttural roar of triumph. The chapel grew impossibly cold, the air shimmering as the form of the little girl distorted, stretching into something tall and skeletal. This wasn't just a hungry ghost. This was something powerful, something that had orchestrated this entire performance. Remembering Silas's words, tools made of carved bone and sharpened obsidian, I tore open the second bag. Inside, nestled in velvet, were objects that radiated a palpable cold. They weren't scalpels. They were cruel, primitive instruments. I grabbed the largest, a long, serrated knife carved from what looked like volcanic glass. The entity lunged, its shriek vibrating in my bones. I didn't think, I reacted. I swung the obsidian knife in a wild arc. It connected with the creature's outstretched arm, and the shriek turned from a psychic attack to one of genuine pain. A black, viscous fluid, thick as tar, sprayed from the wound. The thing recoiled, its form flickering violently. It wasn't a fight, it was a frantic, desperate defense. I brandished the obsidian tool, a pathetic mortal holding a sliver of some forgotten power against an eternal nightmare. The entity stared at the weapon, then at me, its blank face somehow conveying a look of pure, murderous hatred. With one last, agonizing shriek, it retreated, its form dissolving back into the woman and child, who then faded into the chapel's shadows like smoke. I was left standing there, gasping for breath, the obsidian knife slick with a substance that smoked where it touched the air. I hadn't won. I hadn't vanquished anything. I had just barely survived. And as the chapel door swung shut, I knew my role here with sickening clarity. I wasn't here to help lost souls find peace. I was a jailer. The aftermath of the blizzard was a profound, sterile silence. The wind had died, and the morning sun cast long, blue shadows across the snow-covered tarmac. The terminal felt scrubbed clean, the oppressive energy of the previous night having receded like a feverish tide. But the calm brought no peace. As I stood in the break room, the obsidian knife from the second bag lying on the table before me, I felt a permanent change within myself. The fear was still there, a cold stone in my gut, but it was now overlaid with something harder, something colder, the grim weight of understanding. The confrontation in the chapel had stripped away my last illusions. I wasn't a janitor fixing a building. I wasn't a guide helping lost spirits. I was a jailer, a warden for a prison of souls. The protocols weren't just for my safety. They were the bars on the cells. Dr. Finch wasn't a ghostly physician. He was the chief executioner, performing nightly amputations on the spiritual sicknesses that arrived at our gates. And I was the one who handed him his tools. My job was not to maintain balance but to enforce imprisonment. Silas found me there, staring at the knife. He glanced at the strange, obsidian tool, then at my face. He didn't need to ask what had happened. He could see it in my eyes. The horror, the survival, the terrible clarity. "The big ones get bold during the storms," he said quietly, his limp seeming more pronounced in the morning light. "They test the fences, you pushed it back. That's all we can ever do." I thought of the entity's shriek of pain, the hatred in its fading form. "It knows me now, Silas." "They all do," he replied, his voice heavy with a resignation that had taken him decades to earn. "Once you're on the board, you're a player for life." There was no thank you card for surviving the night, no pat on the back. The entities in this place didn't offer gratitude, they offered threats. When I returned to the security office to write my final log entry for the shift, I found it. Taped to the center of my main monitor was a single, old Polaroid photograph. The slick, white border was yellowed with age, but the image was sharp, clear, and impossibly recent. It was a picture of me, sleeping in my own bed in my small, off-site apartment. The photo was taken from a dark corner of my room, a low angle near the floor, as if from the perspective of something small hiding under a piece of furniture. I looked vulnerable, oblivious, one arm thrown over my head. The flash from the camera had been harsh, bleaching out my features but illuminating the room in stark, terrifying detail. They hadn't just been waiting for me at the airport. They could get to me anywhere. They could cross the threshold of my home, stand in the darkness of my bedroom, and watch me sleep. The message was unmistakable. "We know where you live. You are never safe." A wave of nausea and primal fear washed over me. I ripped the photo from the monitor, my hands shaking. For a moment I felt the old desperation, the same panic that had driven me from Minneapolis. The urge to run, to get in my car and drive until the sun came up and never look back, was overwhelming. But then I looked at the obsidian knife still sitting on my desk, its sharp edges seeming to drink the light from the room. I thought of the entity's shriek, of Rick Nowak's shattered mind, of Cole Johansson's face frozen in a scream. Running wouldn't work. The voice on the phone had proven that. It had seen me in Minneapolis. They had been hungry then. They were hungrier now. Running would only make me prey. A new feeling began to displace the fear. It was a cold, grim resolve, a hardening of the heart. I was no longer Leo Vance, the unemployed logistics manager hoping for a second chance. That man was gone, shattered in a chapel by a faceless shriek. I was the custodian now. This wasn't a job I could quit. It was a war one had been drafted into. I picked up the Polaroid, the image of my own unguarded sleep, a chilling reminder of the stakes. I didn't tear it up. I carefully folded it and slid it into my wallet, a personal memento mori. I was no longer hoping for peace, only preparing for the next fight. I looked out the window at the pristine white snow stretching to the horizon. In Minnesota, we know how to survive the winter. But I've learned that some things never thaw.